Hey everyone, Scott Sigrist. Um, we have come to the part of our course where we've really completed our survey of modern political theory, concluding with Marx. And the rest of the semester, I'm devoting to assessing modern political theory um, with the help of Eric Voegelin. Be pronounced Voegelin if you're going to be technical, speaking the German, but I'm not German, so I'm Texan, so I'll call him Voegelin. Um, so just a quick recap of where we've come so far. We've most of the course we've spent on um, evaluating, analyzing, evaluating the primary foundational thinkers of liberalism, starting with Hobbes, who laid the sort of conceptual framework for it that was developed in more what we would recognize to be a liberal direction by uh, John Locke and uh, Rousseau, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and Immanuel Kant. And then we also looked at the American founders along the way, right? It's kind of a special case in that the American founders brought in more of the influence of the ancients than these other thinkers who were distinctly modern. So that's one of the unique aspects of the American founding. That whereas Europe, if you might say, went whole hog modern, the American founders retained um, very important aspects of the classical and Christian understanding uh, that goes back all the way back to Plato and Aristotle. Um, and I think you could sum that up by saying the American founders um, adopted modern ideas about government and the mechanics of government and the way to think about power and so on, with an ancient ethics, right? Um, so um, and then Marx is is our representative radical thinker, uh, the most important radical thinker in uh, probably in the whole Western tradition, certainly in terms of his impact. And we didn't really have time to give to do full justice to him, but hopefully my videos have helped you get a decent sense of the value of reading Marx and the limitations of his theory as well. But we're gonna assess all of this with the help of Eric Voegelin um, and his book, which is really a publication of a series of lectures he gave at the University of Munich in 1965. Um, Let me start off. Why Vogelin? Why use this guy Eric Vogelin for the purposes of assessing modern political theory? Um, well, I guess the first answer I'd give is that I consider him one of the greatest, if not the greatest, modern thinkers. Um, a, certainly of the 20th century, he's in I would say, in terms of his learning and the depth and breadth of his knowledge of not only Western civilization, but other civilizations as well. Um, and and his providing a sense of how modernity fits into the whole spectrum of human experience, in particular the West, but also the non-West. Um, so he's just a great thinker. That's the first reason. Um, the second reason is that he helps us really try to understand what's been called the crisis of modernity. Um, And what people mean by that is the the development of Western disorientation and the loss of confidence in our principles and ideals in the West. This has been going on since the 19th century, but it really became acute in the 20th century. And along with this came the viciousness uh, of modern ideological politics, in particular the radical politics of the 20th century, culminating in Nazism and communism, um, the Soviet Union. Understand the crisis of modernity. Um, that's we've looked at so many things that probably instinctively, because of our cultural context, the intellectual culture that we come out of, has it seemed right to you. It's ratified what you already thought in many ways. Although these thinkers have a depth um, of penetration you that has probably already caused you to raise questions about your assumptions. Um, but this, uh, how did we get to this point of the 20th century, the bloodiest century, arguably, in the history of the world? Um, this was, this following on the heels of a great period of optimism um, with the Enlightenment and the rise of progress and so forth. Right, the bottom fell out. What happened? Right, and is this crisis ongoing? I mean, I think, in the sense of a loss of confidence in um, ideas about truth and the values that we've upheld in the West is very much with us. Um, and then getting down to political theory per se, Voegelin will help us get at the premises of modern political theory, right? Getting more deeply at the premises, um, as opposed to just the logic of modern political theory, right? We've looked at these theories; they're coherent on their own terms, right? I mean, they're logical, um, uh, often rigorously logical. The the conclusions follow from the premises. You could arrive at different conclusions from the premises if you attack certain of the points along the way, so that Locke adopts a, a very similar conceptual framework as Hobbes does, but comes to very different conclusions. But we haven't seen many of the modern thinkers really seriously question their own premises. Um, Oftentimes, the premises themselves are um, presented um, sort of in a vacuum uh, without taking on the alternative premises of the ancients. There's plenty of attention given to the ancients by people like Hobbes, who want to systematically attack what the ancients were doing, the ancients' understanding of things like justice and the basis of political order and so on. But it would be harder to say that they actually engage the ancients on the ancients' own terms and wrestled with the arguments as presented by the ancients, right? Um, and so we haven't had much um, basis on which to compare these two. How do we know how compelling uh, to see Hobbes and Locke's and Rousseau's and Kant's arguments, right? Um, so Vogel's going to help us weigh or give more of critical attention to those premises and also to the motives and the motives behind the theories and the forces driving modern political theory. All right. Um, so then a few comments on Voegelin's life and work. Okay, so the context of Voegelin's uh, political science uh, in the beginning was Nazi Germany. He was German, um, and he wasn't Jewish, but he was wanted by the Gestapo for writing a couple of books on race, which, while not mentioning the Nazis by name, um, presented an absolutely devastating attack on racism as as intellectually incoherent, philosophically incoherent. And this is something that the Nazis didn't like, of course. Um, so he's a young scholar in Nazi Germany. He ends up being chased out of Germany, literally by the Gestapo. Right? They almost caught him. He escaped with his wife. And the other important part of the context is the German intellectual trends that had preceded Nazism and were continuing uh, during and after it, which Voegelin concluded were incapable of uh, helping him respond adequately to a problem like Nazism and like Hitler. So the context is the rise of a great evil in Nazi Germany, right? But also intellectual, philosophical approaches that were incapable of helping him understand and come to terms with this great evil, right? Um, Not only that, but as he concluded later, these philosophical trends in Germany actually facilitated and enabled uh, the rise of Nazism, right? So that this uh, what we get in Nazi Germany is the crisis of modernity in its starkest manifestation, right? Um, if you want to see the dark edge of modernity, you don't get much darker than Nazi Germany, right? Um, well, related to this is what I would call Voegelin's significance for political theory, which is a very radical critique of modernity, radical in the sense of going to the radix, the root of modernity, the philosophical schools, the ideologies, the mass movements related to them, a critique of modernity, and um, providing a restoration, or at least attempting a restoration and refinement of classical and Christian political philosophy. He turned to uh, focus on classics, the Greek classics and the Christian classics, because they uh, they dealt with problems in a way that could help him come to terms with an evil like Hitler and Nazism, um, because they dealt with what sometimes called soulcraft and the internal dynamics of human beings, the passions, and their relation to reason, and so on. And Voegelin felt that the kind of scientific analysis, the analysis in social sciences claiming to be scientific, were relatively superficial. They weren't getting to the core of things, which was what drives us as human beings. Um, and the core of Vogelin's theory, which is a huge task to uh, to grasp uh, as a whole. He had a huge number of writings, and they're very difficult, which I'll talk more about in a minute. But the core of his theory really is um, the effort to recover and clarify the existential basis, the basis in um, in those internal human dynamics of right order and justice, and also of disorder and injustice. Right. This is specifically what the modern philosophers and ideologists could not tell him, right, or um, could not come to grips with this existential basis of political order. Um, One more thing before we get into the text of Hitler and the Germans um, is uh, about reading Voegelin. It's tough. It's tough not because he's not a good writer or because he uses jargon. Uh, it it's tough because uh, it's on such a high level um, intellectually in terms of the substance of the ideas, and also to some degree in terms of the way he talks about them. Um, but he's developing technical terminology, right? And the technical terminology is one of the things that's different. Um, so he's having to do. You see this in the early going of the lectures that in Hitler on the Germans. He's trying to discard cliches, uh, political cliches, and opaque, or non-descriptive, or misleading wording that prevent us from coming to terms with reality. And he thinks this kind of this kind um, terminological problems are of crisis proportions in modern social science, um, as well as just modern culture more generally. He wants to discard that problematic language, language doesn't allow us to come to terms with reality, and replace them with clear and precise language that gives access to reality. And oftentimes these are ancient words um, eh, or neologisms of ancient words. A neologism is where you combine some some term with another term, or put a new twist on the term, uh, an older term, to capture some phenomenon that doesn't have a word for it, or not one that's really relevant or clear to everybody right now. And so so he'll talk about he'll use the Greek for a reason when he's talking about classical philosophy, nous, um, and he'll do that because reason, as it's come to be used in the modern context, means something different than reason meant for the ancients. Um, he'll use a wide range of terms that are unfamiliar to you, because partly because many of them are ancient terms that he gives in the original, not always language, it's not Greek lettering, but what's the terms, transliteration, or you know it, phonetically he gives the ancient word, right? Um, and or these he just makes up terms, right? Partly based on these, or based on something else. Um, and the reason he's doing this is not jargon. This is technical language. I mean, jargon is when people are sort of mindlessly repeating, uh, you know, academic phrases that they've heard, and that kind of thing, and talking shop, if you will. Um, what he's trying to do instead is find language that uh, captures descriptively or gives access to um, some reality that modern language is not doing. Um, so we'll see plenty of examples uh, as we go along. He starts off his analysis in chapter 2 with a lot of cliches that were being used that were not clarifying and that actually were obstacles to understanding. Right. Um, so um, and this points Witt to what he considered to be a major problem in modern philosophizing um, and modern social science was what you could call a corruption of language. So, and the key here for Voegelin was that moderns have largely lost contact with certain fundamental experiences um, that that and because they've lost contact and because they're not familiar with ancient writings, they tend to just ignore them, right? The language used to describe those old experiences that would help us come um, restore those old experiences have become opaque. He used the term opaque, right? So in the beginning, they captured the reality very precisely and very clearly. But now, because we don't we're sort of alienated from those experiences, and because we don't have a good classical education, we don't the language seems nonsensical to us. Right? Um, so um, so it's a challenge to read Voegelin. It's a challenge on two levels. One is the unfamiliarity of a lot of the language, but the second is unfamiliarity with many of the experiences that he's saying have been lost, right? And so just for example, I mean, I mentioned reason is one. We've lost contact with the the experience of reason and illumination that people like Plato talked about. But we've also lost contact, he thought, with the meaning of the Christian notion of faith, for example. What most people call faith today is not what was meant, Voegelin thinks, by the original users of the term. Um, so, um, so, so it's tough. It's challenging. You may find it the hardest thing that you've ever read. Not because the writing's not interesting, but because it's so um, technical in this way and so unfamiliar to you, right? But the payoff is huge. Uh, the payoff is huge because once you master Voegelin's terminology, it is extraordinarily clarifying. Once you get it, then the realities that he's talking about become much clearer to you as well, right? Um, and Voegelin, reading Voegelin is not only valuable for understanding the world of human experience, but also for your own deeper awakening, I think. Voegelin taps into what you could call ancient wisdom. Um, I think from Vogelin's perspective, uh, he would acknowledge many benefits of modern political thought, uh, but among those benefits is not wisdom. They provide a lot of intelligent, brilliant um, solutions to certain practical political problems, but they lack wisdom. So Voegelin thinks, right? Um, so getting to the lectures themselves, um, Hitler and the Germans. So just a word about the story behind the lectures. These were lectures given at the University of Munich in 1965 to an audience of it was an actual course, but there were other people sitting in the audience, including both students and professors. And many of these professors had stayed on during the Nazi period. I mean, they're still around. They had stayed on, and so arguably many of them were compromised. And Voegelin pulls no punches. He lets them have it. I mean, not directly. Say, you professors, perhaps, and that was when the primary purpose of his lectures. But it's an electrifying atmosphere. Um, he's, he's returned to Germany from America, where he's been teaching and studying and writing to Germany, and takes up this analysis not only of Hitler but of what was it about Germany that caused them to support Hitler, which is much more unsettling if you're German at the time. And as you see, as you open up the lectures, you see that they're still dealing with what to do with Nazi war criminals and stuff like that. I mean, there's still stories in the news every day about Nazi war criminals, and it's still very much front and center in the German mind of how do we deal with this horrible dark episode in our history, right? And so Hitler and the Germans is it's not a book; it's a series of lectures. Because it's a series of lectures, he doesn't always go into much length explaining things. And so you shouldn't read it as like a treatise or something where he's working everything out in detail. He's talking to professors and students in a live audience and teaching a course, right? And I don't know if you realize this, but we professors have to leave a lot out in order to convey to you the main ideas, right? So chapter 1. This course is presented may make you very uncomfortable, but this course is presented as an introduction to political science, even though it's maybe the hardest thing you've ever read. An introduction to political science, and so one of his early concerns here is the question of how do you do political science? If you're going to analyze something like Nazi Germany, how do you go about it? What is a scientific way to go about this, right? And so this gets to the heart of the question of political science. How do you do political science, right? And the way Voegelin understands it, the subject matter, broadly speaking, of political science is what he described in another place as experience and symbolization. Right? He thinks that understanding politics, the key to understanding politics, is to understand the experiences of people in political society. Right? The thing to understand is those experiences. And the way to understand those experiences is not just what people do, but especially what they say and how they justify what they do. The symbols they create linguistically, and sometimes more in the sense we usually think of symbols, in terms of images and so forth. But the symbols they use to express the experiences they have. And if those experiences are dark and disturbing, well, the symbolism can capture that as well. So you have to understand the way people talk about themselves and the symbols they use in establishing their identities and so forth, and the self-understanding of a society, and then get at the experiences underlying that. That's the subject matter of political science, as Voegelin sees it. In terms of the scientific enterprise, Voegelin setting up his analysis by, he's giving, I can't remember if he actually explicitly says this at any point, but he's presenting it along the analogy of a physician, a doctor, right? The doctor, if you come into a doctor and say you're like, I'm afraid I have the coronavirus or something, well, the first thing the doctor has to do is determine the problem, right? And he says in political science, the first thing is to establish the problem. What is the problem that you're looking to solve here? What is, as he put it, the theoretical problematic, right? And in this case, he says, and we'll talk about this more later, but he says the problematic is not Nazism or even Hitler. The problem is Hitler and the Germans. The problem is what makes Hitler Hitler, and why did so many Germans fall for him, and the ideology he presented. That's the problem. That is the problem to be understood. If you try to narrow that problem down more, then you're not getting the big picture. And if you try to make the question bigger, then you're getting into territory that's not relevant to what you want to understand. The problem of Hitler and the Germans. So that establishes the problematic there, the theoretical problematic, the thing the theory needs to understand. Right. The second thing is to diagnose the problem. Right. Like a doctor say, okay, I've looked at your symptoms. You're clearly sick. So what's the diagnosis here? What do you have? Do you have the coronavirus or not? And to determine this, the doctor has to use diagnostic tools, right? We've got these tests going on for the coronavirus, but he has to have the right tools, right? It's got to be a good test. It's got to be appropriate for understanding the problem. So I mean, a lot of times people go in and they get misdiagnosed for something. They realize later that okay, they're having headaches or something, and the doctor suggests maybe it was that time you fell down a couple of weeks ago or something. But it turns out later, after a couple more visits, maybe a second opinion, it's a tumor or something, right? It's pretty important to diagnose it right if you're going to treat it. And diagnosis means ultimately here getting down to the causes of the problem. Okay, you identify the problem. You get in a sense of what the nature of the problem is, what kind of problem it is, and diagnosis involves getting at the causes ultimately of the problem, right? In this case, coronavirus. In the analogy, in the political case, what causes somebody like Hitler? What causes Hitler to become Hitler? What causes the German people, or at least a critical mass of the German people, to fall under his spell? And it's critical in this diagnosing of the problem and developing the diagnostic tools, as he says. Right now we're looking for a vaccine, right, for the coronavirus, and that takes time because there's all kinds of things that go into it. But Voegelin stresses here and elsewhere that to do political science, or to do any science, you have to let the subject matter determine the method. Right? Not every method is applicable to every problem. Right? So, and so, for example, if one of the features of modernity, as he brought up earlier, is that moderns tend to think of science, including political science, social sciences, on the model of the natural sciences and the scientific method that, as we understand it, in the natural sciences, right? And so we think of it in terms of mathematics and quantifications or experiments, regression models, as now they talk about it, and statistics and so forth. But whether those models are well suited for understanding political reality depends on what that reality is, right? For example, if you're trying to get at something like justice and injustice, what tyranny is like, and so forth, um, statistics aren't going to help you a whole lot. They're not a good tool for that, for understanding that, right? And so, and that's part of his unhappiness with modern philosophy and uh, especially even more so modern ideologies, but both of them, is that they're using the wrong method. They're using a method that won't allow them to come to terms with a problem, right? So it's not true that there's one method for every scientific problem. You've got to get the right method. And you've got to let your theory be determined by the facts rather than the other way around. You don't start with a pet theory and then uh, look only at the facts that uh, fit theoretical assumptions, right? You don't try to cram the facts in to fit the theory. If you're being scientific, you don't. A lot of scientists do this, especially social scientists. But you gotta build your theory out of the facts, not not the other way around, right? This is what it means to be scientific, and this is critical for getting the right diagnostic tools. Right? Then third, okay, you establish a problem, you diagnose the problem, then the question is prognosis and prescription, right? You've been diagnosed with a with a tumor, and and you ask the doctor, what's the prognosis, doctor? How long do I have to live? Or is there any way to what are my odds of getting over this cancer, and so forth, right? Um, and the prognosis deals with the trajectory of the problem, right? What is likely to happen? Uh, this can go to prediction, and any kind of scientific enterprise. Certainly, um, at least certainly the case in terms of social science. You want to be able to predict things. You study history because you hope to know that if this kind of thing is happening, well, this kind of thing is likely to happen next, right? And so in political science, if you set up this kind of government, what likely is that to do for the people or fail to do for the people, and so on, right? Um, so what's the prognosis? And what's the prescription, doctor? Do you have any medicine for this? Do I need to get surgery? Etc., right? It's the prescription, right? And Voegelin sometimes talks about this prescription in terms of therapy. There's a kind of therapy. And the therapy involves, relating to what we said earlier, it involves getting the right language and coming to terms with the experiences. And those are going to go together. You're not going to know whether the symbol fits, the way you're talking about something fits, unless you are well tuned to that reality itself. Right. Okay, so to the current study specifically, how do we start? And Voegelin starts with the present. This is something I should have done more in the beginning of our course, I think. Throwing you into Hobbes without too much, without sort of pointing where you are on the map. Um, maybe made it a little difficult for you to engage. But the starting point is the present. We live in the present. We can't know anything about the past except from the present, right? Hopefully we can imaginatively grasp what's going on in the past, but we can't go there. We don't have a time machine yet. Starting point is the present, and that's where he starts, right? He starts looking at the newspaper articles, looking at some of the stories about these war criminals and popular opinion about you know, what to do with them, and that kind of thing, right? Um, and specifically, one of the things, the most important thing to come to terms with in the present is problems in the present that are preventing us from understanding the past event uh, that that we're trying to understand, right? I mean, for example, if you're trying to understand uh, jihadism, which is the primary subject of my research these days, um, and you come at trying to understand it from a Western ideological perspective, you may not be able to understand it. Uh, you may have to first question um, and sort of put out of the way your own ideological presuppositions to come to terms with the phenomenon, right? And so that's the kind of thing he's looking at, right? And one of the first things that comes up is what he names the buttermilker syndrome. Right? The buttermilker syndrome is he names it because there's this guy who lived on Buttermilk Street uh, who couldn't believe um, that Hitler uh, had genuine popular support. Uh, People knowing what the kind of person they were following, because if that was the case, then I mean the whole population was stupid, um, you know. And he thought, ergo, right? Uh, it must be the case that he just pulled the wool over our eyes, and we can't really, we can't really be responsible. Those of us who followed him, right? Um, and Voegelin first wants to call into question this assumption. It's a very democratic sensibility. It seems to think that if a majority of people think this, well, there must be something to it, right? After every election, until recently, I suppose, um, the majority determined something. We say, well, the people have spoken, right? And you reassess everything in light of the people having spoken. Um, but is this really a sensible way of trying to understand the truth of something, right? What difference does it make how many people go for it? And why couldn't it be the case that a whole mass of people could be stupid? Now, as you're going to see, the way he's talking about stupidity is a little different than uh, what we normally have in mind. Normally, when we think of stupid, we mean intellectually incapable, right? That's not what he means. That's not what Voegelin is going to mean when he focuses in on this problem of stupidity. It's a different kind of incapacity. So bear that in mind. So he starts out, he questioned this assumption that, well, surely the whole population couldn't have been corrupt, or a huge majority, or at least a majority, or even a critical mass of the people couldn't have been corrupt. Not that many people could be so bad that they would embrace Hitler, right? And Voegelin says, well, I'm not sure that's a safe assumption. Then Voegelin notes that in these stories about the Nazi war criminals, a language problem. He suggests that people have lost uh, a moral language that's adequate to talk about. And he brings up as sort of a minor example remember this witness at the murder trial in Auschwitz, the Auschwitz trial. And one of the witnesses on the stand, when one of the Nazi officers is presented, says, "Murderer! That's a murderer!" Right? And what Voegelin points out is that the judge um, reprimands the witness for saying, well, this is still to be determined, and so forth. Um, and Voegelin's point is that what the Nazis did, the appropriate term for it is murder, right? I mean, yeah, talking about establishing the guilt or innocence of this person, but to prohibit the use of the term murder is the precisely correct term for what the Nazis were doing, right? So what he's getting at is people are becoming unable to call a spade a spade. Right? They speak in euphemisms. It's always, you never describe something as, uh, say, terrorism. For example, you describe it as actions of gunmen or something like this, right? Recovering a moral language, he thinks is important, and he thinks Germans still in the 1960s have not discovered the right way to talk about what happened in the Nazi period. Right. And then there's, worst of all from Voegelin's perspective, is the failure of social scientists to treat Hitler with any kind of depth of understanding. Right. I mean, there are exceptions. He'll talk about them later. Some scholars who really did really get past the surface. But he singles out this guy Schramm, right? And he'll give further attention to them in the chapter on Hitler that's coming. But Schramm gives what he thinks is a very super. Schramm's study. This is an important thing to note. His study was highly, made a big splash at the time. It was in the news. Schramm was considered sort of the hot new academic scholar on the scene, in relation to Hitler and so on. And but I can't remember if he mentions it here, but he focuses on things like Hitler's blue eyes and his piercing stare and things like this. And Voegelin uses this to bring up the question of relevance. What are the kind of facts that you really need to hone in on and pay attention to try to understand a guy like Hitler? And he feels like the social sciences that's kind of a silly example of the blue eyes and so forth, but he'll go into more depth later. They're not really getting to the deeper problems, right? So, so what is the larger issue, Voegelin? What is he that he's presenting to his audience here? The larger issue for him and for them, and of course, the quote he gives is that the Central German experiential problem of our time is Hitler's rise to power, which includes both Hitler and the Germans. What was wrong with the Germans? Why are we still not able to come to terms in a more than superficial way with what happened, right? This is a problem. And this is not just an intellectual problem. This is an experiential problem. We haven't, in our heart and soul, come to terms with this. And he's speaking as a German to Germans, right? Not an outsider. The we here is important. So that's that again. I mean, that comes back to the initial point that what needs to be understood is the experience, and what is the experiential state of the German people now, and how does that relate to what happened just 20 years before? Right. Okay, that's enough for our first lesson on Hitler and the Germans. I'll see you for chapter 2 next time.